This is the Modise Network, and earlier this week, the acting CEO of the SABC said that the public broadcaster was going to institute a commission of inquiry into editorial interference, and this is something that many people have complained about is happening throughout the newsrooms in South Africa. And I'm joined by Thandi Smith, who is with Media Monitoring Africa, to tell us a bit more about this issue. And of course, in the case of the SABC, it came from the Parliamentary Ad Hoc Committee's recommendations and findings. SABC is doing something about it. But is this widespread?
I think that this is an issue that is far bigger and far greater than a lot of people think, or that it actually comes across. As you said, this is a process that has unfolded at the SABC, well, the look into editorial interference at the SABC since the parliamentary inquiry, and it really is a great step to addressing some of these issues. But it's still, unless the process itself is open and transparent, which, you know, at this point, some suggestions and things we've been hearing is suggesting that it isn't going to be open and transparent. That is a big issue, and that isn't going to be very helpful in the long term. But with your question around whether it's, you know, something that we see across newsrooms, I think yes, and it's not something new. I think that editorial interference is something that is part and parcel of news production. You know, there are all sorts of theories and theorists who unpack these issues.
And we'll talk about the different manifestations thereof. Let's stay with the SABC for a moment. And you say you are concerned that it might not be open and therefore there may not be transparency. My sense is that you expect that something would be found if they probed openly what was going on within the SABC. And of course, the recommendations come from, believe it or not, politicians, members of parliament, and should come more from the editors of the SABC, don't you think? Absolutely.
But, you know, the problem is, part of the problem is with senior management and editors. So, of course, you're going to get an outside push for an inquiry such as this to happen. I do think that we, you know, should recognize the work that the board and the new senior management are doing, and as a result, we now have these processes unfolding and inquiries like these being set up. But you know, the evidence is there, especially with the SABC. As we saw with the parliamentary inquiry, our own research showed that in 2016, with the local elections, was the first time that we saw bias in news content during an election period. And that was, subsequently, we found out that that was a direct result of editorial interference.
Well, I think we're using a mild word here, interference, right? What about intimidation?
Absolutely.
Of those journalists? And
again, stark evidence directing us to intimidation with the case of the SABC 8 that we saw unfold over that, you know, very dark period at the SABC. Intimidation, threats to journalists, and you know, violent intimidation around journalists, and also coming from top management and editorial teams. So I think that yes, it's a good step to set up this inquiry, but if it's not open and transparent, we're not going to see those responsible being held accountable. With something like the public broadcaster, you know, it does hold a different mandate.
But here is something to be said, right? As much as the whole intimidation and interference that took place at the SABC has been widely reported, we saw what happened in Parliament. An argument can be made that the SABC operates in a competitive space anyway. What about other broadcasters? And what about other media, newspapers and so forth? Don't they have a similar problem?
I think they do. You know, and like you said, even though the public broadcaster does have certain mandates, it's accountable to, you know, a different sort of stakeholders. Media itself has a responsibility to be objective, to try and wean out as much editorial interference or intimidation as possible. But I think it's a reality that happens, and you know, I think that we need to advocate for a media that is, I suppose, confident in reporting and confident that editorial interference isn't as prevalent, as you might say. But then, you know, you need to unpack what we said earlier about the different sort of manifestations of editorial interference and sort of where those come from,
sure,
to really get to sort of the bottom of what happens. But I think that it exists in newsrooms across different media platforms. But it's about how you address these things.
And the extent of that, does it warrant a wide kind of inquiry into how the media reports news in South Africa?
You know, I think you need to look at the kinds of interference that takes place. I think that we saw similar sorts of manifestations in, like your previously ANN7 newsroom, where it was a lot of political interference, well, politically shaped, I think you could say, or there was a lot of top-down interference in terms of ownership and content. And again, SABC, it's a lot more political and it's a lot more, I think, yeah, political. But when you look at media with more commercial interests, you see it coming from advertisers and your more commercial pressures. So I don't think it's one thing that you can say, you know, this kind of editorial interference happens across newsrooms. I think it's the different kinds of entities, the different sort of biases and subjectivities that come with private versus commercial versus community. It depends on that, and you sort of need to address those issues individually. But again, as much as we have to realize that this is an issue, and I think that until you realize that fact, you're not going to really be able to unpack what it means.
But I would think that it's very difficult then for media to be said to be completely independent if there are the commercial pressures that you've mentioned, right? And the ideological biases of the editors, including the owners of such media houses.
Absolutely, it is difficult, but the way that you go about addressing that is being open about who you are as a media entity, being transparent about your structures and the way that the media flows, your processes of production, who's reporting what, and you're being open about who your senior management is, who's calling the shots. As an organization, we really advocate for increasing credibility, improving credibility, and we all know that we're dealing with that kind of crisis at the moment.
But there's also the fact that if you do not agree with certain political parties now, they may label you as this or the other, or if people think differently or have a different view about state of affairs in South Africa. There's a so-called Gupta-linked media house that you refer to. That kills their business, doesn't it, when you label it that way? Or white monopoly capital establishment like ENCA has been referred to, and other news organizations. So how should editors and journalists respond to that when they come under attack and are criticized in that way?
Yeah. You know, I think that there are a couple of approaches that you can take. And again, the one is, well, let me go back. We deal with a lot of information on a daily basis. And often, like you're saying, there are these campaigns or sort of misinformation campaigns that promote a lot of negative content. And the one way to address that is to be ready to know that this is something that can come up and is prominent in our space, and be ready to combat that with a good narrative, with the good information, or the accurate information. Media aren't doing nearly enough to promote their own brand and to promote their own transparency and openness. And again, it's all about accountability. If your audience and your news consumers know exactly who you are, know your biases, you are that much more sort of, you could say, safe when dealing with these misinformation campaigns.
But here is a scenario that I want to paint for you. We have elections coming up, right?
Yes.
And there will be a lot of contestation there. A lot of name calling is going to happen. People are going to be referred to this as being in so-and-so's faction, as being pro one party and the other. What is the advice that you'd give media? What is the best way for South African media to cover the forthcoming elections, for instance? I'm just wondering, should any news organization declare that we are supporting such and such a party, or we supporting such and such a view?
Declare as much information as possible. again, you know, your example is interesting because the simple fact that we know that it's coming, that we know that we're going to be dealing with these issues, you can put measures in place to deal with them and combat those. We have brilliant electoral guidelines on reporting. We have really good regulations that come out, and this is the perfect time to be cementing those within the newsrooms. You know, have train journalists on how to cover elections and the best case or best ways of dealing with these issues. You know, again, the fact that we know that these are going to be incredibly contested, if not increasingly violent and turbulent time in the country, there are measures and ways of dealing with it. And again, I can't, you know, reiterate enough the issue around openness and credibility and accountability in newsrooms.
Now, how should then news consumers in South Africa deal with the information that they are presented with? There's a view, for instance, but it's very increasing in South Africa, that corporate interests actually interfere more than political parties in how the media reports the news. And the evidence that's presented is that you don't read as much about private sector corruption in the news media or see it on television as you would public sector corruption.
I think that, you know, it's a great point, and I think that there's a lot of validity in that we don't hear a lot of the private corporate sector, and we do focus attention on public sector issues, but also think that that's completely normal. You know, in any country, I think that corporates get away with far too much, and there is a very high level of lack of accountability in corporates. And media should be focusing attention on them.
Okay. Now, quick question, brief response from you. What do you expect from the SABC inquiry?
For it to be open and transparent and really hold those that we know are in the wrong accountable.
Thank you very much, Thandi Smith, for being our guest. We appreciate it. And Thandi is with Media Monitoring Africa. And of course, still ahead, we're going to talk about data. Is it falling at all, or when is it going to start? Remember to participate in the conversations through #Modise Network.